My name is Walter Gaines. I am 64 years old, and for the past 5 months, I have been the most convincing fool in the state of Ohio. Last Sunday evening, I sat at the head of a long oak dining table in my own home, surrounded by people I had trusted with my life, watching my son pour something from a small glass vial into my bourbon when he thought my back was turned. He did it quickly, smoothly, the way a man does when he has practiced a thing many times in his head before doing it with his hands. Then he set the glass in front of my plate and smiled at me from across the table, that broad, easy smile I had watched grow from a gap-toothed boy's grin into something that no longer reached his eyes. I smiled back. What my son did not know was that the man sitting to my left, my old college roommate and the best tax attorney in Columbus, had his phone recording every second of what was happening in that dining room. What my son did not know was that I had not touched that bourbon. What my son did not know was that he had spent 5 months constructing an elaborate trap, and that tonight was the night he was going to fall into it. But before I tell you what happened when his wife's brother drank from that glass instead, let me ask you something. Drop your city in the comments right now. And tell me, do you believe a man can love his son and still refuse to be destroyed by him? Because that is exactly what this story is about. My son's name is Nathan. He is 38 years old. His wife's name is Diane. She is 35, sharp-minded, and the kind of woman who walks into a room and immediately begins calculating what everything in it is worth. I had never trusted Diane. Not from the first Thanksgiving she attended at my house, when she spent 20 minutes asking me pointed questions about my pension, my real estate holdings, and whether I had updated my will recently. Nathan had laughed it off. She is just curious, Dad. She likes to understand how things work. I had nodded and passed the cranberry sauce and said nothing. That was 6 years ago. My wife, Carol, passed away 3 years back. Breast cancer. 18 months from diagnosis to the end. And every one of those months felt like a year and a minute at the same time. Carol was the kind of woman who made the whole house feel inhabited, even when she was in another room. After she was gone, the silence in the house had weight. You could lean against it. I had built Gaines Fabrication over 32 years, starting with a single CNC machine in a rented warehouse outside Dayton, and eventually employing 400 people across 2 facilities. 6 months after Carol died, I sold the company to a private equity group out of Charlotte for just under $22 million. I was tired. My knees ached. I wanted to travel to the places Carol and I had always planned to visit and never did. I wanted to read books in the afternoon without feeling guilty about it. I wanted to be an old man who had earned his rest. Nathan called me the day after the sale closed. He was excited in a way I had not heard from him since he was a teenager. A kind of breathless, barely contained energy that I recognized, even then, had nothing to do with happiness for me. Dad, he said, we need to talk about the money. I told him I had advisors. Good ones. People I had worked with for years. He told me my advisors were old school. He told me that Diane's brother, Ryan, was a financial strategist who had managed portfolios for some of the wealthiest families in central Ohio. He told me that 22 million sitting in conservative instruments was 22 million slowly losing ground to inflation. He used words like liquidity and diversification and alternative asset classes. I told him I would think about it. I called my attorney instead. His name is Gene Pulaski. We had been friends since 1983, when we were both broke and idealistic and sharing a 2-bedroom apartment near Ohio State. Gene had gone into law and I had gone into manufacturing. And over 4 decades we had stayed close the way men do when they have known each other through the worst and best versions of themselves. Gene, I said, something is off with my son. Gene did not ask me to explain. He said, give me 2 weeks. He called back in 11 days. He came to my house on a Tuesday evening and spread papers across the same oak table where everything would eventually unfold, and he told me what he had found. Ryan Calloway, Diane's brother, was not a financial strategist. He was a licensed attorney, but his specialty was guardianship and conservatorship proceedings. He had been involved in 14 such cases in the past 7 years, and in 11 of them, the elderly subject of the petition had their assets transferred to a family member within 90 days of the guardianship being granted. Jean had also found that Nathan and Diane had taken out a second mortgage on their house 8 months ago for $240,000. They were behind on payments. I stared at the papers for a long time without speaking. "They are going to try to have me declared incompetent," I said. Jean nodded. "That would be my assessment, and Diane is the one driving it." He was quiet for a moment. "Nathan is not a stupid man, but Diane is smarter, and she has been planning this for longer. I think your son knows what he is doing, but I am not sure he fully understands what he has agreed to become." That was the hardest sentence I had heard since Carol's oncologist told me the cancer had spread to her lymph nodes. My son, my only child, the boy I had coached in Little League, driven to every wrestling practice in 2 counties, paid for college and graduate school, and the down payment on his first house. That boy had looked at his father and seen a problem to be solved and a number to be extracted. I sat with that for 3 days, and then I made a decision. I was going to give them exactly what they were waiting for. Over the following weeks, I became a different man in their presence. I forgot names. Not all the time, just enough. I called Nathan by his cousin's name twice at Sunday dinner. I left the stove on once when Diane was visiting, and let her find it. Let her exchange that quick, loaded look with Nathan when they thought I was out of the room. I told the same story about selling the company twice in one conversation, watching Nathan's face cycle through impatience and guilt and something uglier that he tried to hide. I left an opened envelope from my financial advisor on the kitchen counter with some numbers circled in pen. The way a confused man might do, the way a man who was losing his grip might leave evidence of his own incompetence lying around for anyone to find. Jean hired a security firm. Cameras went into my house. We monitored Nathan's phone, legally, through channels Jean would not fully explain to me, but which he assured me were solid. We built a file. The file got thick, fast. 3 weeks before the dinner, Jean played me a recording of a phone call between Nathan and Ryan. They were talking about a psychiatrist named Dr. Kenneth Farwell, who had a practice in Westerville and a history of producing evaluations that, Jean told me with the flat expression of a man reading from a particularly grim document, tended to align with whatever outcome his clients required. Ryan had worked with Farwell before. The plan was to bring Farwell to my house after a family dinner where I had been, in Ryan's words, visibly impaired. Get a preliminary evaluation done informally. Then file the emergency guardianship petition, visibly impaired. I listened to that recording twice. Then I poured myself a glass of water and stood at my kitchen window looking out at the yard where Nathan had learned to ride a bicycle, where Carol had planted her garden, where I had spent 30 summers grilling on Sunday afternoons. I stood there until the anger settled into something colder and more useful. Then I called Jean. I said, I want to let them try it. All of it. Jean was quiet for a moment. The dinner is in 3 weeks. Are you sure? I said, I want to watch his face when it ends. I staged the dinner myself. Family gathering, I told Nathan. Just us and Diane and Ryan. Nothing formal. I told him I had been feeling off lately, that I wanted to spend time with the people I loved. Nathan said that sounded wonderful, Dad, and I could hear the relief in his voice, the slight loosening of tension that told me he had been waiting for me to make things easy for him. Ryan arrived with a bottle of wine I did not open. He was a tall man, 40 or so, with the careful posture of someone accustomed to courtrooms and the habit of watching everyone in the room without appearing to do so. Diane was warm in a way that had always made the back of my neck tighten, all practiced smiles and lingering touches on my arm, the kind of warmth that has done the math before it reaches you. I had cooked Carol's pot roast from memory. I had set the table carefully, and Gene Pulaski was in my study off the hallway with his phone recording, and 2 plainclothes officers from the Columbus Police Department, who had been briefed by a detective Gene had worked with for 15 years. We ate. I played my part. I fumbled with the salt shaker. I mentioned Carol twice and let my eyes go glassy each time. I asked Ryan what he did for a living, and then asked again 15 minutes later, watching the look he and Diane exchanged over the rim of their wine glasses. I had to admit, a convincing old man losing his grip. After dinner, I got up to clear plates and left the room. I did not go to the kitchen. I went to the doorway and turned and watched. Nathan reached into the pocket of his jacket. He took out a small vial, the kind that might hold eye drops. He checked to see that Diane and Ryan were watching, and then he tipped 2 drops into my bourbon. Diane's hand found Nathan's forearm and squeezed once. I came back to the table from around the long way, through the living room, the way I sometimes did when the kitchen was crowded. I was an old man. I moved slowly. No one clocked me coming. As I passed behind Ryan's chair to reach my seat, I stumbled. It was the same kind of stumble a 6, 4-year-old man might take after a long week and a glass of wine before dinner. I caught myself with both hands on the back of Ryan's chair, and in the same motion, the motion I had rehearsed alone in this kitchen 6 times, I reached across and moved my bourbon glass to Ryan's side and slid his untouched water glass to my place. It took less than 3 seconds. I was an old man recovering from a stumble, and no one watches an old man stumble. "Sorry about that," I said, straightening up and patting Ryan on the back. "These knees have been arguing with me all week." Ryan waved it off without looking up from his phone. I sat down. The bourbon that had been mine was now in front of Ryan. I raised my water glass and said something about being grateful for family, and everyone raised their glasses, and Ryan drank. I watched Nathan watching me over the next 20 minutes. He was waiting for something, a slurred word, a confused look, evidence that the drug had found its target. I gave him only steadiness. I talked about the Browns. I asked Diane how her mother was doing. I was the picture of a man who had enjoyed a quiet evening meal with his family. And then Ryan set down his fork. He blinked several times in rapid succession, the way a man does when the room has suddenly decided to rearrange itself. His hand came up to his temple. He said, "Excuse me," and his voice had a thickness to it that had not been there before. "Dad?" Diane said, turning toward Ryan. "I'm fine," he said. And then he was not fine. He pushed back from the table and stood too fast, and his legs did not hold the way he expected them to, and he went down heavily, his shoulder catching the edge of the table as he fell, sending the water pitcher to the floor in a cascade of ice and glass. Nathan was on his feet in an instant. "Ryan," he said. "Ryan, what happened?" Diane was screaming for someone to call 911. I sat in my chair and did not move and looked at my son, and for just a second, before the panic fully took over his face, I saw something else there. I saw him look at me, and I saw the first flicker of understanding pass through his eyes like a cold wind. I met his gaze and said nothing. The ambulance came in 9 minutes. The paramedics were efficient and calm in the way people are when they have seen every variety of human catastrophe. They stabilized Ryan on my dining room floor while I stood in the hallway watching. Diane rode in the ambulance. Nathan stayed behind, standing in my living room with his hands at his sides, staring at me. "Dad," he said. "What happened?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't know, son. I don't notice much these days. I have been so fuzzy lately." He looked at me for a long time. His mouth opened and closed. He was running the calculations, trying to find where the error was. He had seen me drink nothing from the glass. Or had he? He had seen me raise the glass. He had assumed the rest. That was his mistake. That had always been his mistake. He assumed his father was the kind of man who could be managed. Jean opened the study door. "You might want to come in here, Nathan." Nathan turned. He saw Jean. He saw the 2 officers. He saw the camera Jean was holding, its light blinking red and steady. "What is this?" he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "This," Jean said, "is a recording of you adulterating a beverage with the intent to impair your father's mental faculties in furtherance of a fraudulent guardianship scheme. That's the short version." Nathan looked at me. "Dad," he started. I shook my head. "I am not ready to hear that yet," I said. "Let the officers do their job first." At the hospital, the ER physician told us that Ryan's blood work showed a significant concentration of a sedative compound. The amount found was consistent with deliberate administration rather than accidental exposure. She was required to report it. She looked at each of us in the waiting room as she said it, and her eyes stopped on Nathan for a beat longer than the others. The detective who arrived was a compact, quiet man named Dorsey. He interviewed everyone separately in the small family consultation room down the hall from the nurse's station. When it was my turn, I sat across from him and rubbed my eyes and spoke slowly. "Detective Dorsey," I said, "I am an old man, and I was very confused tonight. I honestly cannot tell you exactly what I saw. My memory has not been reliable lately." He studied me for a moment. Then he nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Gaines. We may have additional questions." "Of course," I said. "I want to be as helpful as I can." I found Nathan in the hallway outside the waiting room. He was standing with his back against the wall, his face emptied of its usual confidence. He looked, for the first time in years, like the boy I remembered. "You switched the glasses," he said. It was not a question. I said nothing. His jaw tightened. "Dad, I never wanted it to go this far. I want you to know that. It was supposed to be simple. Just a petition. Just getting some oversight in place. Diane said it was the responsible thing. She said you needed protection." I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about the 38 years I had spent making sure he wanted for nothing. I thought about the Saturday mornings driving to wrestling tournaments in borrowed vans, about the college application essays I had read draft after draft of, about the down payment check I had written without hesitation. I thought about Carol, who had loved this boy so completely that she had made me promise, in the last weeks of her life, to take care of him. "I am taking care of him," I thought. "This is what that looks like. What you wanted," I said quietly, "was $22 million. What Diane wanted was $22 million. And what Ryan was going to help you take was everything I spent my life building." Nathan's eyes were wet. I told myself it was guilt and not calculation. I hoped I was right. "We are not done," I said. "Not even close. Go home, Nathan." He went. I did not go home that night. I stayed in a suite Jean had booked at a hotel downtown, and I sat by the window looking at the city lights and thought about what came next, because the dinner had been phase 1, and phase 2 was already scheduled for Thursday evening. 2 days after the dinner, just as Jean had predicted, Nathan called. His voice was controlled, rehearsed in the way a man's voice sounds when someone smarter has told him exactly what to say. "Dad," he said, "we're worried about you. What happened with Ryan at dinner, the way you've been acting lately? Diane and I have been talking, and we think it would help if you sat down with someone, a professional, just to talk, just to make sure you are getting the support you need." I let a silence stretch out. "What kind of professional?" I asked. "A doctor, a psychiatrist. His name is Dr. Farwell. He specializes in helping older adults manage transitions. He's very kind, Dad. You'll like him. Kenneth Farwell, the man who wrote whatever his clients needed written. The man Ryan had worked with before. There he was, right on schedule." "Okay," I said. "I suppose that makes sense. I have been feeling so muddled. Maybe talking to someone would help." I could hear the relief in Nathan's exhale. "Good, Dad. Good. We'll come Thursday, 7 o'clock. I hung up and called Jean. "Thursday at 7, I said. "We're ready," Jean said. Thursday came gray and cold, the kind of November evening that arrives in Ohio like a foreclosure notice. Nathan arrived at 6:55 with Diane, and a man I recognized from the photograph Jean had printed out for me. Kenneth Farwell was 60, silver-haired, and dressed with the self-conscious elegance of a man who wanted to be taken for someone more distinguished than he was. He had a briefcase and an expression of cultivated compassion that had been applied like paint over something harder and less charitable underneath. "Walter," he said, extending his hand, "I've heard a lot about you. Your family cares about you very much." I shook his hand with both of mine, the way a confused old man grips something solid. "It's so nice to have visitors," I said. "The house gets quiet." Diane took my arm and led me to the living room, couch the way you lead someone who might fall. Nathan sat on the love seat across from me, and Farwell settled into the armchair at an angle, open and relaxed, the posture of a man conducting a conversation that is not quite an examination, even though it is exactly that. "Walter," Farwell said, "your family has noticed some changes recently. Some confusion, some difficulty keeping track of things. I am just here to have a conversation, to get a sense of how you are doing. Is that all right?" I stared at the middle distance. "I suppose," I said. I just want to understand what's happening. I feel like things have been moving very fast lately, and I can't quite catch up. Farwell nodded with practiced warmth. That is completely understandable. Managing a significant financial transition on your own, at your age, after a loss like the one you experienced with your wife, it's a great deal for anyone to carry. You shouldn't have to carry it alone. He reached into his briefcase. I want to go over a few documents with you, he said. Just some paperwork that would allow your family to provide the support you deserve. Nothing complicated, just signatures. The papers were everything Jean had told me they would be. Power of attorney. A consent form for a voluntary psychiatric evaluation at a residential facility in Dublin, Ohio. A preliminary authorization allowing Nathan and Diane to access my financial accounts for the purpose of asset management and protection. I looked at the papers for a long time. My hands were trembling. Not entirely from performance. I don't know, I said. I don't understand all of this. You don't need to understand all of it, Nathan said, and there was something in his voice that had sharpened. Dad, we have been watching you struggle for months. This is the right thing. I looked at my son. I looked at Diane, who was watching me with an expression that was 3/4 sympathy and 1/4 impatience. I looked at Kenneth Farwell, whose real name I knew and whose license had been flagged by the Ohio Medical Board twice in the past decade. There was a moment then that I had not entirely anticipated. A moment where I looked at Nathan and saw, behind all of it, behind the greed and the cowardice, and the woman he had married, and the choice he had made, a version of the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat on the drive home from camping trips. And I felt something that was not anger. It was something much older and much quieter and much harder to carry. Then I looked at Jean's study door and said, clearly and without tremor, I think I have heard enough. The door opened. Jean walked out first. Behind him came Detective Dorsey and his partner. Behind them came a woman from the Ohio Adult Protective Services Office, who had been briefed for 2 weeks on exactly what was in our file and exactly what she was looking at. Nathan stood up so fast his knee caught the coffee table. What? He said. What is happening? Kenneth Farwell sat perfectly still. He had the expression of a man reviewing his options and finding none of them good. This, Jean said, is a recording of the entirety of this evening's conversation. It is also one of several recordings gathered over the past 5 months, documenting a coordinated scheme to fraudulently obtain guardianship over a mentally competent adult for the purpose of financial exploitation. He looked at Diane, who had gone the color of old paper. That is a third-degree felony in Ohio, under Section 2913.02 of the revised code. It carries up to 5 years. Diane, Nathan said. Don't, she said, without looking at him. Her voice was absolutely flat. Detective Dorsey moved toward Farwell first. Kenneth Farwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and unlawful practice of medicine. He turned to Nathan. Nathan Gaines, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse and felony assault. Assault? Nathan said. Ryan Calloway was hospitalized because of a substance you placed in a beverage in this home on Sunday. The substance and the method of delivery have been confirmed by the crime lab. But, Nathan started, I didn't mean for Ryan to drink it. It was supposed to be. He stopped. The room was silent, except for the sound of Nathan understanding, all at once, exactly what he had just said. Intended for who? Dorsey asked. Nathan closed his mouth. He looked at me. I stood up from the couch. I did not use the armrest for support. My knees ached, but I stood straight, the way a man who has spent 30 years on a factory floor learns to carry himself through pain. I love you, I told my son. I want you to hear me say that, because it is true, and it will still be true when this is over. And none of what happens tonight changes it. But I will not let you take from me what I spent my life building. And I will not let you turn me into a ghost in my own house so you can settle Diane's debts and run. Nathan's face cracked. Just for a second, just at the corner of his mouth and his eyes. The boy came back. Then Dorsey took his arm, and it was over. Diane did not cry. She walked to the door with the officers with the composed, upright posture of someone who had already accepted the outcome and was now concerned only with how she appeared within it. I had the fleeting thought that she would have made a formidable businesswoman under different circumstances and in a different life. Then she was gone. Farwell was led out in handcuffs, which seemed to disturb him more than anything else about the evening, the indignity of it. He asked twice about his briefcase. Jean told him it was evidence. When they were gone, I stood in my own living room and looked at the dining room table through the doorway, at the chairs pulled back from where people had stood suddenly, at the empty glasses and the cold plates. The house was very quiet. It was the same quiet that had been there since Carol died, the kind that has weight. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like space rather than absence, like a room waiting for something new to come into it. Jean sat down across from me. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon from the bottle on the sideboard, real bourbon, untouched, and pushed one across to me. "Are you all right?" he asked. I picked up the glass and held it without drinking. "I don't know yet," I said. "Ask me in 6 months." He nodded. "That is a reasonable answer." The legal process took 8 months. Diane's attorney negotiated a plea agreement that reduced her charge in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Nathan and Farwell. She received 2 years of probation, a significant fine, and a civil judgment that would follow her for a long time. She and Nathan were divorced before the criminal proceedings concluded, which told me everything I needed to know about the architecture of that marriage. Kenneth Farwell, who had been under investigation on unrelated matters, pleaded guilty. He received 18 months, the revocation of whatever remained of his medical credentials, and a ban from ever again serving as an expert witness in any guardianship proceeding. Nathan was convicted on 2 counts and sentenced to 4 years. He served 2 before being released on good behavior. I visited him twice while he was incarcerated. The first visit was 3 months in, when he still had walls up and we talked mostly about nothing. The second was 14 months in, and that visit was different. He sat across from me in the visitation room and looked at his hands for a long time, and then he looked at me, and he said, "I don't understand how you don't hate me." I thought about Carol. I thought about what it cost her to keep loving people after they disappointed her, and how she had done it anyway, without diminishment or performance. I thought about the fact that hatred requires a kind of ongoing investment I was no longer willing to make. "I never hated you," I said. "That was never the danger." He looked at me. "What was the danger?" "That I would let you do it," I said. He was quiet for a long time after that. After the trials ended, I found myself at loose ends in a way I had not expected. I had fought so hard and for so long that the absence of the fight left a kind of silence in my days that was different from grief, but not entirely unlike it. I started walking in the mornings. I called old friends I had let drift during Carol's illness in the company years. I drove down to Dayton twice to have lunch with men I had worked beside for decades. And then Jean called me on a Wednesday afternoon in early spring. "I got a call from a woman in Youngstown," he said. "Her name is Dorothy. She is 71 years old. Her daughter and son-in-law have been slowly moving money out of her joint accounts for 8 months. She didn't realize what was happening until the bank flagged an irregular transfer. She has no idea what to do or who to trust." I set down my coffee cup. "Send me everything you have on her case," I said. Jean was quiet for a moment. "Just like that?" "Just like that." Dorothy drove down the following week. She was a small, white-haired woman with very clear eyes and the kind of composure that comes from having survived a number of things the world did not intend her to survive. She sat across from me at the oak dining table, in the same chair where Nathan had sat on the evening everything ended, and she told me her story. She told it carefully, with precision and without self-pity. And when she was finished, she looked at me and said, "I know what they are doing is wrong. I just don't know if I am strong enough to fight it." I looked at her for a moment. I thought about every version of that sentence I had ever heard or felt. I thought about all the people who said it and meant it and who never found out that they were wrong about themselves. "You don't have to be strong," I said. "You just have to be willing to start. The rest comes." She held my gaze, and then she nodded. A small, decided nod, the kind that has already done its thinking and is now ready to act. I picked up the phone and called Gene. "We have a new case," I said. He was at my door in 40 minutes. That was the beginning. Gene and I formalized the arrangement over the following months, incorporated a small nonprofit, hired 2 investigators and a paralegal who had spent 6 years at the state attorney general's office handling elder fraud cases. We built a hotline. We built a website. We took cases we believed in, and we took them without charge because the people who needed us most were often the people who had already had everything taken from them. The calls came from across Ohio, then from Pennsylvania, then from other states. A man in his 70s whose niece had forged his signature on a reverse mortgage. A woman whose second husband of 4 years had been systematically draining the pension she had saved over 30 years of nursing. A retired teacher who had signed documents she did not understand at the urging of a son who told her it was just estate planning. We could not help everyone. That was the hardest thing to learn. Some cases came to us too late, when the money was gone and the legal pathways were narrow. Some people called us once and then stopped calling, and we never learned why. Some families were too tangled in their own grief and loyalty and shame to see clearly, and we could not see for them. But some we could help, and those were enough to keep going. Nathan called me on a Tuesday evening, about a month after he was released. He was living in an apartment in Akron and working for a logistics company, a job that Gene had quietly helped him find through a contact who owed Gene a favor and knew nothing about the specifics. Nathan did not know Gene had arranged it. I had not told him. He said, "I want to make this right, Dad. I don't know if that's possible, but I want to try." I said, "It is possible. It will take a long time." He said, I know that." I said, "Then we start with that." He came to the house the following Sunday. He sat at the oak table, the same table where he had poisoned my drink and watched for signs that it had worked. And he ate pot roast that I had made from Carol's recipe. And we talked carefully and slowly, the way you talk when you are rebuilding something, and you know that going too fast will cost you the progress you have made. After dinner, he stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes without being asked, the way he used to, when he was 12 years old, and Carol was sick with a cold, and he wanted to help without knowing how to say so. I stood in the doorway and watched him. This man who was my son, and who had tried to take everything from me, and who was here now, washing dishes in the kitchen where he had grown up. There is a version of this story that ends with me alone in a memory care facility in Dublin, Ohio, watching my money move into accounts I cannot access, watching my daughter-in-law sign papers I never understood, watching myself disappear a little more each day until there was nothing left to take. Derek made that version of this story possible, but it was the only one he knew how to write. I wrote a different one. There is something they do not tell you about growing old. Not the ache of it, not the slowness. They do not tell you that the older you get, the harder you are to kill. Not physically, something else. You have seen too much. You have survived too much. The things that are supposed to destroy you, loss, betrayal, grief, the casual cruelty of people who should have known better, they land differently at 64 than they would have at 30. They still hurt, but they do not surprise you, and that absence of surprise is its own kind of armor. I am not a man who wanted to be tested this way. I would have traded all of it for a few more years with Carol, for a son who chose differently, for the ordinary life of a retired man with aching knees and a too-quiet house and nothing more to fight than boredom. I would have traded it in a heartbeat, but that was not the trade I was offered. I was offered this one instead, and so I took it. If you have listened to this far, thank you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to protect yourself from someone you loved? Have you ever had to watch a person choose greed over family and then decide how much of yourself to hold on to afterward? I want to hear your stories. Not because misery loves company, but because the people who call our hotline, the Dorothys and the retired teachers, and the old men sitting alone in houses that feel too large, they need to know they are not the only ones. They are never the only ones. My name is Walter Gaines. I am 64 years old. I run a small nonprofit out of Columbus, Ohio with my oldest friend, and I wake up every morning grateful for the thing I almost did not see coming. Never underestimate the man who has already lost the most important thing in his life and survived it. He has nothing left to be afraid of. And that makes him, in ways you cannot calculate or anticipate or drug out of existence, the most dangerous man in the room.